Stand up. Walk in your room for 1 minute, and at the 30-second mark, push your pace until you cannot finish a sentence without stopping for breath. Hold that pace for 90 seconds. Now stand still. Feel where your chest is. Feel the heat in your cheeks. Feel the small tremor in your thighs. What you just did to yourself is going to land in your bed tonight, somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning, as a measurable change in the depth of your sleep. I want to tell you what happened in there, because almost nobody walks this way, and almost nobody knows why they should. I am not talking about exercise. I am not talking about cardiovascular fitness. I am not talking about losing weight, or living longer, or any of the other things people put walking under. I am talking about a single 90-second event you can drop inside an ordinary walk that will rewrite the architecture of tonight's sleep before you sit down to dinner. Let me show you what just happened inside. Behind the bridge of your nose, about 3 centimeters in and a little above, sits a small knot of cells called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It is roughly the size of a grain of rice. It contains around 20,000 neurons. It is the master clock that decides when you fall asleep, when you wake up, and what your body temperature should be at 4 in the afternoon versus 4 in the morning. Just above it, in the preoptic area, sits a sleeve of neurons that throws what the sleep researchers call the flip-flop switch. The switch that takes you from waking to sleep not gradually, but with the abruptness of a light going out. Underneath that, in the brainstem, you have the reticular formation, the arousal system. That is the thing keeping you upright and listening to me right now. And running through your chest and into your gut, you have the vagus nerve, the largest cable of the parasympathetic system, the nerve that breaks your heart and slows your gut and quiets your body when the danger is past. Now move out from the brain. In every muscle you use during that 90-second push, your quadriceps, your calves, the deep muscles in your hips, you have mitochondria, trillions of them, little furnaces. They take fuel, mostly glucose and fat, and convert it into the chemical your cells actually run on, a molecule called adenosine triphosphate, ATP. And every time ATP is spent, every contraction of every muscle fiber, one of the breakdown products is a smaller molecule called adenosine. Plain adenosine, same molecule, minus the 3 phosphate groups. Hold on to that word. We are going to come back to it. And when we do, it is going to do something to you that the sleeping pill in your medicine cabinet has been imitating for 30 years. Badly. Now, let me tell you about temperature. Your body has a temperature set point. It is not constant. It is a curve. Around 4 in the afternoon, your core temperature is at its peak, usually around 37 degrees Celsius, sometimes a tenth or two higher. By around 4 in the morning, it is at its lowest, maybe 36 and a tenth, 36 and 2/10. That curve is set by the suprachiasmatic nucleus I just showed you. It is the same curve day after day unless you do something to disturb it. Here is what almost nobody knows. The drop in core temperature in the late evening is not just a consequence of falling asleep. It is the signal that triggers falling asleep. The hypothalamus reads its own temperature, and when that temperature begins to drop, the flip-flop switch I mentioned earlier gets thrown more easily. This was worked out, painstakingly, by Jürgen Aschoff and his colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Andex in southern Germany across the 1960s and 70s. He built underground bunkers, actual bunkers, no clocks, no daylight, no temperature variation from outside. And he kept volunteers in them for weeks at a time, measuring their body temperature continuously while tracking when they chose to sleep. He found something that surprised even him. The sleep-wake cycle and the temperature cycle are not just correlated, they are coupled. The temperature drop precedes sleep onset. The temperature minimum sits roughly 2 hours before natural waking. Take the temperature curve away, and the sleep pattern fragments. Steepen the curve, and the sleep deepens. So here is the question. If a temperature drop triggers sleep, what would happen if you made the drop bigger? That is what 90 seconds of hard effort does. It raises your core temperature briefly by about half a degree, sometimes a full degree. Not because you are exercising for a long time, but because the heat produced by vigorous muscular contraction outruns the body's ability to dump it. The skin reddens, the cheeks flush, the face perspires. You felt all of that 30 seconds ago. Then you stop. And what happens over the next 2 hours, the next 4 hours, is that the body, recognizing it just overheated, opens up the skin blood vessels and dumps that heat with a vengeance. The core temperature falls. It falls past where it started. It falls below baseline. By the time you are getting ready for bed, your temperature curve has steepened. The descent into the nightly minimum is deeper and faster, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus reads that as a signal that means it is time. The switch throws cleanly. You fall asleep faster, and you fall asleep into a stage of sleep we are going to talk about in a moment. Now, the same 90 seconds that did this to your temperature also did something to your blood chemistry. Let me show you. There is a number in exercise physiology called the anaerobic threshold. Carl Wasserman at the University of California in Los Angeles named it in the 1960s. Below that threshold, your muscles are getting enough oxygen, and the byproducts of energy production are mostly carbon dioxide and water. Above it, the demand outruns the oxygen supply, and the muscles start producing lactate. For 70 years, the physiologists thought lactate was waste, junk, the garbage left over from inefficient combustion. They thought it caused the burn in your muscles, that it was the source of fatigue, that it had to be cleared from the blood as quickly as possible. They were wrong. A young fellow named George Brooks at Berkeley published a paper in 1985 that is still being argued about. He proposed that lactate is not waste at all. It is a fuel. It is shuttled in the bloodstream from the muscles that produce it to the tissues that can burn it. The heart burns it. The liver converts some of it back to glucose. And, this is the part that matters, the brain, particularly when the bloodstream is delivering it at higher concentrations, takes it up and uses it as fuel for neurons. A neuron has a small power requirement, but it has a large appetite. Roughly 20% of your resting metabolic rate is spent on the brain, which is about 2% of your body weight. So when an alternative fuel arrives, when lactate spills into the bloodstream after a 90-second push, the brain notices. What happens to a brain that has just been bathed in lactate is still being worked out as I speak. The early evidence, and I want to be careful here, suggests two things. One, lactate appears to act as a signal, not just a fuel. It seems to encourage the cells around the neurons, called astrocytes, to do their cleanup work more aggressively. Two, lactate appears to interact with structures in the hypothalamus that have to do with sleep regulation. I do not want to oversell this. Brooks's lactate shuttle hypothesis was published only 2 years ago, and the implications for sleep are speculative. But the broad picture is consistent with what we already knew. Brief, hard efforts, the kind that push you past anaerobic threshold for a short time, produce a different sleep architecture than long, steady walks. Jim Horne at Loughborough University in England has been measuring this since the late 1970s. He has consistently found that vigorous bouts of exercise, performed earlier in the day, increase the amount of slow-wave sleep, the deepest stage, in the following night. Steady, easy walking does not produce the same effect. Or, if it does, the effect is much smaller. That phrase, slow-wave sleep, is the thing I want you to remember. We are coming back to it. Now, the same 90 seconds that raised your temperature and spilled lactate into your blood also did something to the molecule I asked you to hold on to, adenosine. Remember what I told you about ATP? Every contraction of every muscle fiber in your legs during those 90 seconds was powered by ATP. Hard contractions spend ATP faster than soft ones. And every ATP that is spent leaves behind, somewhere downstream, a molecule of adenosine. In the muscle, that adenosine is mostly recycled. The cell uses it to make new ATP. But in the brain, the situation is different. The brain has been spending ATP continuously, every second you have been awake, since the moment you opened your eyes this morning. And as the day goes on, adenosine accumulates in a specific region called the basal forebrain. It accumulates outside the cells, in the extracellular fluid. It diffuses. And it binds to receptors on the surface of certain neurons. There are two kinds of adenosine receptor that matter for sleep, A1 and A2A. When adenosine binds them, it does something elegant. It inhibits the neurons that are keeping you awake, and it activates the neurons that promote sleep. The longer you are awake, the more adenosine accumulates, the harder it becomes to stay awake, and the easier it becomes to fall asleep. This is what the sleep researchers call sleep pressure. Or Process S. Alexander Borbély in Zurich published the model in 1982. Two processes working in parallel. Process S, the homeostatic sleep pressure that accumulates with wakefulness. Process C, the circadian rhythm I described a moment ago, the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the temperature curve. They interact. When process S is high and process C is at the right phase, sleep onset becomes nearly automatic. When either is missing or weak, you lie awake. Now here is what brief, vigorous effort does. It spikes ATP consumption in working muscle, but it also spikes ATP consumption in the brain, because the brain has to coordinate the movement, modulate breathing, balance the body, monitor cardiac output. Those neurons are firing harder. They are spending ATP faster. They are leaving adenosine behind faster. By the end of a day that contained 90 seconds of real effort, the adenosine load in your basal forebrain is higher than it would have been after a day of only easy walking. Sleep pressure is higher. The flip-flop switch is more loaded. I want to give you a sense of how robust this mechanism is. The most common stimulant on Earth, caffeine, works by doing exactly one thing. It blocks adenosine from binding its receptors. That is all caffeine does. The molecule is shaped almost identically to adenosine, so it slides into the same receptor and squats there, refusing to activate it and refusing to let adenosine in. That is why your coffee keeps you awake. Not because it is a stimulant in the traditional sense, because it hides the signal that says, time to sleep. When you take that signal and amplify it through vigorous effort, you are building exactly the pressure that caffeine taken hours earlier was preventing you from feeling. The two interventions work on the same receptor, from opposite directions. Now I want to bring in something different, because the same 90 seconds did one more thing you might not expect. It activated your fight-or-flight system briefly, and the consequence of that brief activation is what gives you the calm that arrives later. When you push the pace, your sympathetic nervous system fires. The adrenal glands sitting on top of your kidneys release adrenaline and noradrenaline into the bloodstream. Your heart rate climbs. The pupils dilate slightly. The bronchi in your lungs open up. The blood vessels in your gut constrict, and the blood vessels feeding your working muscles open. This is the response that prepared your great-grandfather to run from a bear. And then you stop. What happens next is one of the more elegant pieces of physiology in your body. The sympathetic system, having surged, falls, but it does not just fall back to baseline. It overshoots. The parasympathetic system, the vagus nerve I mentioned earlier, rebounds. Your heart rate variability increases. Your gut starts moving again. Your face cools. And inside your body, the dominant signal shifts from go to settle. This rebound is measurable. The cardiologists have been using a technique called heart rate variability since the 1960s to assess it. People who do brief bouts of vigorous effort, then stop, show a stronger parasympathetic rebound than people who do steady, moderate effort. The difference shows up in the resting heart rate hours later. It shows up in the readiness of the system to enter the rest and digest state. And rest and digest is what sleep is, at the autonomic level. In the hours after that 90-second push, your vagal tone, the steady-state activity of your parasympathetic system, is higher than it would have been otherwise. Higher vagal tone is correlated with deeper sleep, faster sleep onset, and more time spent in the slow-wave stage I keep mentioning. I want to be careful again. Not every study finds the same magnitude of effect. The variability between individuals is enormous. Some people get a big vagal rebound from 90 seconds of effort. Some get a smaller one. And the timing matters. If you do the burst too close to bedtime, the sympathetic surge has not finished decaying, and you might find yourself wide awake at 11 o'clock, wondering why you cannot settle. The window I would point you to, based on the work that has been done, is roughly 4 to 8 hours before you want to be asleep. So if you are aiming for an 11 o'clock sleep onset, the 90 seconds wants to live somewhere between 3 in the afternoon and 7 in the evening. That is the window where the temperature spike has time to overshoot downward, the lactate has time to be metabolized, the adenosine pressure has time to build, and the vagal rebound has time to settle into its higher tonic level. Now the temperature is dropping, the adenosine is binding, the vagus is humming. What sleep do you fall into? That is the last mechanism, and it is the one with the biggest payoff. Slow wave sleep. The deepest stage of non-rapid eye movement sleep. The stage where your electroencephalogram shows long, slow, synchronized waves. The brain firing in chorus rather than chatter. The stage from which it is hardest to be woken. The stage that, if you do not get enough of it, you cannot make up by sleeping longer. You can only make it up by sleeping deeper. Slow-wave sleep is where the body does its repair work. Growth hormone, the major anabolic hormone of the adult body, is released in pulses during slow-wave sleep. And the largest pulse of the night occurs in the first deep cycle, roughly 30 minutes to an hour after sleep onset. If you miss that cycle, or if you spend it in lighter sleep, you do not get the same pulse. The protein synthesis you would have done overnight is reduced. The repair of small tissue damage from the day is slower. Slow-wave sleep is also where the brain consolidates declarative memory, the things you learned today, the names you heard, the new piece of information you read at lunchtime. It is during slow-wave sleep that the hippocampus replays the day's events at high speed and transfers them gradually into the cortex, where they become long-term memory. So slow-wave sleep is not just any sleep. It is, in some sense, the point of sleep. Now, what Jim Horne and his colleagues found, beginning in the late 1970s and continuing through the 1980s, is that vigorous physical activity earlier in the day increases the proportion of the night spent in slow-wave sleep. Not just total sleep time, specifically slow-wave sleep. The increase is most reliable when the exercise is intense enough to elevate body temperature significantly and to push past the anaerobic threshold. And here is the part that matters for you. The increase can be observed even when the total amount of exercise is small, provided that some of it was vigorous. 90 seconds, embedded in a 30-minute walk, qualifies. Let me give you the rough numbers, with the caveats they deserve. In Horne's experiments, vigorous bouts of activity produced increases in slow-wave sleep of around 10 to 20% compared to a no-exercise control night in fit subjects. The increase was larger in subjects who were not used to vigorous effort. The increase was smaller, or absent, if the vigorous activity happened too close to bedtime, or if the subject was elderly and not regularly active. These findings have been broadly replicated, including by Roy Shepard's group in Toronto. So now you have the whole chain. The 90 seconds raises your temperature. The temperature overshoots downward, sharpening the sleep signal. The lactate spills into the blood and reaches the brain. The adenosine load climbs in the basal forebrain. The vagal rebound deepens. The sleep onset arrives more readily. And the sleep you enter is, on average, deeper, with more slow-wave activity, more growth hormone, more memory consolidation, more genuine repair. That is what a single 90-second push, dropped inside an ordinary walk, is doing to you. I want to stop here and tell you, honestly, how confident you should be in each piece of what I just told you. because not all of these mechanisms have the same evidence behind them, and I do not want to flatten the differences. The temperature mechanism is the most established. Aschoff's bunker work, Czeisler's later work at Harvard, and Mary Carskadan's sleep onset studies have built up a strong, replicated picture of the coupling between core body temperature and sleep onset. You can take that one to the bank. The temperature drop precedes and facilitates sleep. If you steepen the drop, you facilitate sleep more. This is not controversial. The adenosine mechanism is nearly as solid. The fact that caffeine works by blocking adenosine receptors was worked out by John Daly at the National Institutes of Health by the early 1980s. And the role of adenosine in sleep pressure has been demonstrated in animal models in many laboratories. The two-process model from Borbély's group has been refined, but not overturned. The general principle, more ATP spent during the day, more adenosine accumulated, more sleep pressure, is on firm ground. The slow-wave sleep amplification from exercise is well replicated, but the magnitude varies. Horne, Shepard, and others have shown the effect across multiple studies, but the size of the effect depends on the fitness of the subject, the timing of the exercise, the intensity, and the individual. Call this one strongly suggested, but not pinned down to a precise number. The vagal rebound mechanism is plausible and supported by heart rate variability data, but the link from vagal tone to specific sleep architecture is more inferential than direct. I would call this one physiologically consistent, less directly measured in sleep studies. The lactate as brain fuel mechanism is the newest and the most preliminary. Brooks's lactate shuttle paper was published only 2 years ago. The implication that brain lactate uptake influences sleep is speculative, even if the broader physiology is sound. I would not bet the farm on the specific lactate to sleep pathway. But the indirect effects through temperature, through vagal rebound, through adenosine do not depend on it. So when I tell you that 90 seconds of vigorous effort changes your sleep, I am telling you something that is, at its core, very well established. The pieces I am less sure of are the icing on the cake. The cake itself is real. Now let me tell you something that should make you uncomfortable. The most common sleep aid in this country as I speak is a class of drugs called benzodiazepines. Diazepam, lorazepam, flurazepam. There are perhaps a dozen of them in common use, and tens of millions of prescriptions written every year. They work by binding to a particular site on the receptor for a neurotransmitter called gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA. When benzodiazepines sit on that receptor, the inhibitory effect of GABA on certain neurons is amplified, and the neurons that keep you awake are quieted. Here is what very few people will tell you. The flip-flop switch in your preoptic area, the same switch I described to you earlier, the one that takes you from waking to sleep, is mediated, in significant part, by GABA. The endogenous sleep-promoting neurons of the preoptic area release GABA onto the arousal neurons of the brainstem, and that release is what flips the switch. A benzodiazepine, in effect, drugs that same switch. It does not start the cascade. It does not raise sleep pressure. It does not coordinate with your circadian rhythm. It does not do the temperature drop or the vagal rebound or the adenosine accumulation. It walks in at the end of the chain and forces the receptor to act more strongly than it otherwise would. What we just walked through together, the temperature drop, the lactate, the adenosine, the vagal rebound, the slow-wave amplification, is the natural pathway that ends at the same switch the benzodiazepine is forcing. The 90 seconds is the same destination. It just arrives there through the front door instead of through the wall. I want to be honest about the dose. A benzodiazepine is a sledgehammer. It will put you to sleep when nothing else will. And there are situations, acute anxiety, severe insomnia, withdrawal from other drugs, where the sledgehammer is the appropriate tool. The body's version, the 90-second walk burst, is gentler. It will not put you to sleep when you have just had 3 cups of coffee at 9 in the evening. It will not overpower a racing mind in the middle of an emergency. The interventions are not equivalent in dose, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But here is what matters. The benzodiazepine, on any given night, does not build a natural cascade. It interrupts it. Used regularly, it reduces the proportion of slow-wave sleep. It reduces the growth hormone pulse. It accumulates tolerance. The body's response is to compensate, to make sleep harder without the drug, to build dependence. The pharmaceutical fix and the physiological fix are not just different paths to the same destination. They are paths to different destinations that look similar from the outside. The 90 seconds, repeated daily, builds the cascade. The pill, repeated nightly, dismantles it. There is an old saying I want to tell you about. If you are old enough, you have heard a version of this from a parent or grandparent. Tire yourself out before bed. A hard day's work makes for a sound night's sleep. The walk before supper sets the night. The country doctors of my grandparents' generation, the ones who made house calls with a black bag and a stethoscope, said variations of this to people complaining of insomnia. Their advice was almost never a pill. It was almost always, walk after supper, fast enough to break a sweat, then come home and let the body cool. If you cannot break a sweat from a walk, find a hill. If you cannot find a hill, climb the stairs. If you cannot climb the stairs, do something hard with your arms before you turn in. They did not know about Aschoff's bunkers. They did not know about Borbély's two-process model. They had not read Brooks on lactate or Horne on slow-wave sleep. They knew what worked because they had watched it work in patient after patient. What they knew in plain language was this: the cool that follows the heat is what brings sleep. The tiredness that follows the effort is what holds the sleep down. The body, having been worked, sleeps. The body, having been spared, does not. That is the same cascade I just spent 30 minutes describing. Temperature drop after temperature spike. Sleep pressure built by spending ATP. Vagal rebound after sympathetic surge. Slow wave amplification after vigorous effort. The country doctor said it in 12 words. I said it in 5,000. We were talking about the same thing. So, tonight, before supper, take your walk. And somewhere in the middle of it, push the pace for 90 seconds until you cannot finish a sentence. Then, keep walking, easy, the rest of the way home. Eat your supper, read something, go to bed at your usual hour, and in the early morning, in the deepest part of your sleep, somewhere around 2 o'clock, when your core temperature has reached its lowest point, when the adenosine load is still high in your basal forebrain, when your vagus is humming quietly and the slow waves are rolling across your cortex in long, synchronized sheets, your body will be doing the work it does at no other time. Repair, consolidation, cleanup, the night work. That work was set in motion by 90 seconds you took this afternoon on a walk you were already going to take anyway. 90 seconds. Just find them. If you've tried this kind of brief, intense burst inside a regular walk, tell me what you noticed in your own sleep that night and how long it took before you began to notice it.